The year was 1995. In the small English town of Ellesmere Port, 13 miles south of Liverpool, 41-year-old Martin Griffiths had just bought the post office on Hope Farm Road for a whopping £100,000. The purchase of the business was part of his retirement plan, with Griffiths intending to settle down in comfort and financial stability. 24 years later, in 2019, but tragically, things weren't going to turn out that way. In fact, Martin's decision to buy the little post office on Hope Farm Road would wind up killing him long before he reached retirement, in the largest miscarriage of justice in British history. However, in theory, Griffiths' plan was a good one. 99% of post offices in the UK are doled out as franchises to self-employed owners called subpostmasters, with the other 1% run directly by the central company, Post Office Limited. In that sense, the UK Post Office is run sort of like McDonald's. The central company sells off franchise rights and splits the business revenues with the owners of the individual branches. The key difference from McDonald's is that Post Office Limited doesn't really turn a profit. It often hemorrhages money and fights a losing battle to stay out of the red, especially with the rise of the internet, email, and private sector shipping companies. But the post office is regarded in the UK as an essential service, and so the company, Post Office Limited, is propped up by hundreds of millions of pounds in government subsidies every single year. And while, at a glance, the post office looks like a private sector corporation, it is in fact a company created by an Act of Parliament and functionally beholden to the British government, its only shareholder. And just like the overwhelming majority of government-run companies, the UK Post Office is plagued by inefficiency, incompetence, a bloated bureaucracy, and an utter lack of accountability on part of its lavishly paid executive management. Not that Martin Griffiths was worried about that at all. As a sub-postmaster, he stood to make a tidy profit from his share of the fees people paid for postal, financial, and government ID services, along with the retail income from greeting cards, stationery, and bits and bobs that his wife, Gina, sold in the shop. Griffiths also collected a modest salary from the Central Post Office, and upon retirement would be given a pension funded by the government. Things ran smoothly for the first 14 years of the business. Martin Griffiths would balance the books at the end of each day, and at the end of each week he would pay out any monetary shortfalls that he owed to the central company. The problems started in 2019. The executive management of the post office told Griffiths that he had to adopt some accounting software to balance his books, a program called Horizon, designed by the Japanese IT company Fujitsu. The software had first been introduced in 1999 to the tune of £1 billion in taxpayer money, the largest non-military contract in Europe at the time. In fact, the Horizon accounting software had been salvaged from a disastrous failure by Fujitsu to create a new pensions and welfare payment system that had cost the British taxpayer $700 million. The Horizon accounting software was gradually rolled out to 11,500 privately owned post offices over the course of the next decade, and by 2009, Griffiths was ordered to adopt it in his little shop. By then, the crippling problems with the Horizon software had been known to IT experts, hundreds of sub-postmasters, and the executive management of the post office for several years, and it would soon be the subject of an expose in the British trade magazine Computer Weekly. Bottom line, the Horizon accounting software consistently messed up its own accounting. It couldn't balance the books, the one single solitary thing that the government had paid £1 billion for it to do. Griffiths was none the wiser and simply complied and adopted Horizon, thinking all would be well. Within days, discrepancies started to appear in his financial records. The Horizon software was claiming that his little post office was taking in much more money each day than he was getting in actual business. On paper, it looked like hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds were disappearing from Hope Farm Road's accounts every single week. Griffiths contacted the post office about the software, but was firmly told that Horizon was just fine, there were no problems with it, and that the monetary shortfall must be user error on Griffiths' part. This was a bold-faced lie. Before long, the amount of money that was unaccounted for prompted the post office to call Griffiths into an interview with an investigator paid by the central company. Griffiths was not permitted to bring along any kind of legal representation. During the interview, the investigator alternated between accusing Griffiths of incompetence and outright theft. The investigator then demanded to know how Griffiths would repay the thousands of pounds he owed to the post office. Griffiths was made to feel like he was the only sub-postmaster in Britain who was having problems with the Horizon accounting system. Griffiths was never told that by 2009, hundreds of sub-postmasters had experienced similar troubles, and IT experts had become heavily critical of Horizon's software. Ultimately, Martin Griffiths had to pay the money back, which obliterated his profits and forced him to dip into his family savings. But the shortfalls continued. They grew more frequent. Griffiths quickly ran out of his own money and borrowed more from his elderly parents. When they couldn't loan him anymore, Griffiths started taking out bank loans at fairly high rates of interest. For the next 4 years, Griffiths worked a full-time job for the privilege of losing all his money and going deeper and deeper into debt. He fell into a chronic depression, coming home from work, staring into space, not wanting to talk, and not wanting to do anything or go anywhere. His wife tried relentlessly to cheer him up, but to no avail. Eventually, she took Griffiths to a series of doctors who prescribed various antidepressants and got him into counselling, but Griffiths just wouldn't engage. Back at the post office, the problems continued to mount. Under threat of disciplinary action, lawsuits, and even jail time, Griffiths paid the Post Office Limited approximately £102,000 to make up for the shortfalls concocted by the faulty Horizon software. On 2 occasions, when Griffiths was unable to repay, Post Office Limited suspended his salary, making his financial situation worse. Then, in July 2013, the central company informed Martin Griffiths that his sub-postmaster contract would be terminated at the end of October. They accused him of being a thief, which is all the more perverse when you consider the Post Office Limited was fully aware that there were problems with Horizon software, and hundreds of sub-postmasters across the United Kingdom had reported similar difficulties with it. Shortly after getting his notice of termination, the post office on Hope Farm Road was robbed. Griffiths was attacked with a crowbar and suffered a broken thumb. The thieves made off with £10,000 in cash. When Griffiths informed Post Office Limited, he was told that he would have to repay the money. Meanwhile, the Central Post Office continued to threaten him with lawsuits and potential jail time. Martin Griffiths was bankrupt, his livelihood destroyed, and his dreams for the future in tatters. On September 23rd, 2013, a month before his contract was due to be terminated, Martin Griffiths deliberately walked in front of an oncoming bus. He was taken to hospital in critical condition and spent nearly 3 weeks hooked up to a life support machine. He died on October 11th, 2013, at age 59, having never regained consciousness. He left behind a loving wife and 2 children. The hero of our story here is a man named Alan Bates. Back in March 1998, Bates and his partner Suzanne Sercombe purchased a post office in the suburb of Craigydon in the North Wales town of Llandudno. They saw it as a way of gaining financial stability, while Susan pursued her interest in art and Bates walked amid the picturesque hills of the Welsh countryside. Along with the £60,000 they paid for the business, Bates and Sercombe shouldered the additional expense of renovating the shop, modernising its electricity and plumbing, and building an extension to the store that added 50% to the overall floor space where they could sell retail goods. Bates and Sercombe sank all their life savings into the project in the hope that they would enjoy a thriving business and a steady income for decades to come. It seemed like a recipe for an idyllic, quiet life. Alan Bates acted as the sub-postmaster and, back in 1998, did the shop's accounts by hand. Meanwhile, in London, a storm was brewing. The British government had paid the Japanese IT company Fujitsu $700 million to develop a swipe card system by which pensioners and welfare recipients could receive payments directly into their bank accounts when visiting their local post office. The British government awarded this enormously lucrative contract to Fujitsu for 2 reasons. 1, then Prime Minister Tony Blair was put under huge pressure by the Japanese government to do so, and 2, the Fujitsu bid for the contract asked for the least money out of all the competing IT companies. Fujitsu was the cheapest option, and it showed. The swipe card project was an utter failure, and in May 1999 the plug was pulled. However, in order for the government, and in particular the post office management, to avoid bad press for such a tremendous squandering of taxpayer money, they, somewhat perversely, paid Fujitsu hundreds of millions of pounds more in taxpayer money to retrofit the accounting software that came with the failed swipe card system. And so, in such squalid circumstances, Horizon was born. Yay. Horizon software would allow local post office branches to record their transactions and balance their accounts electronically, but from the very start, Horizon was plagued by glitches and it couldn't even keep accurate accounts, randomly changing numbers, duplicating transactions, and failing to tally up accurate totals. It was a £1 billion Excel spreadsheet that didn't even work and was literally worse than useless. And because of the immense cost, neither the post office nor Fujitsu were willing to admit to the public how badly they'd messed up. If they did, it would almost certainly result in several exorbitantly paid and high-powered executive managers getting fired. Instead, the post office and Fujitsu chose to save their own skins and bury the problem. As far as their public statements were concerned, Horizon was an impeccable system that would bring the postal service into the 21st century. Horizon was rolled out to the first few post office branches in the UK in the autumn of 1999. Alan Bates adopted Horizon in his shop in late 2000. Within weeks, Bates saw that Horizon was reporting a shortfall of £6,000, but Bates knew this money hadn't just disappeared, so he went over his shop's transactions with a fine-tooth comb and discovered that Horizon had duplicated multiple transactions in its records. This accounted for about £4,800 of the shortfall. Bates contacted his area manager to find out what to do about the other £1,200 that had allegedly gone missing. He did not get a response. Over the next few years, whenever a new area manager was appointed, Bates would broach the subject with them, but they never gave him an answer. Bates also asked for access to the Horizon system so he could see the data that was being recorded at the other end, but his requests were ignored. Meanwhile, the shortfalls continued to appear in the Horizon accounting system, and Bates carefully refused to accept the calculations performed by Horizon and just rolled over the accounts to the following week. This way, he avoided putting on record that his shops had a shortfall, thus making him liable under his sub-postmaster contract to pay the money out of his own pocket. Bates also refused to sign his name to any documentation that claimed the calculations done by the Horizon system were accurate. In 2002, the original £1,200 shortfall was finally written off by the post office as irretrievable loss, but there were thousands more pounds in shortfall that Bates had refused to put his name to. Accordingly, in 2003, Bates was ordered to stop rolling over his accounts and to accept Horizon calculations. After consulting with a lawyer, Bates contacted the post office in writing and refused, saying that forcing him to accept faulty calculations would violate his contract. In response, the post office terminated Bates' sub-postmaster contract with 3 months' notice and without giving a formal reason. Bates' last day of service as sub-postmaster was November 5th, 2003. It functionally meant that over £60,000 in Bates and Sercombe's business investment went up in smoke. For a few years, Bates and Sercombe kept up the retail part of their shop, but they had to close the post office within it. Retail itself didn't bring in very much money, and Bates contacted his local Member of Parliament, Betty Williams, about what the post office had done, but Williams eventually told Bates that there was nothing she could do. Bates wrote about his problems with Horizon and the post office's response in a letter to the UK trade magazine Computer Weekly. A journalist, Tony Collins, looked into the issue, but the magazine ultimately could not publish at the time due to lack of sufficient evidence of widespread problems with the Horizon software. In 2006, Bates and Sercombe applied for planning permission to renovate their shop in order to make it more economically viable, but they were denied by the local council, and so Bates and Sercombe sold the shop and moved out to the Welsh countryside to rebuild their lives from scratch. But Bates couldn't let go of the injustice of the situation, and he frequently pondered the question, surely we can't be the only ones that this has happened to. Jo Hamilton installed a post office counter at her bakery in the village of South Warnborough, Hampshire, in 2003, signing with the post office to act as sub-postmistress. In 2005, Hamilton noticed that massive shortfalls began appearing in the Horizon system. Hamilton called the Horizon helpline and was told by a call centre worker, reading off a script, that she was the only person in the UK who was experiencing these problems with the accounting software. Hamilton assumed that her own accounting was at fault and repaid the shortfalls, as she was contractually obligated to do. In order to accomplish this, Jo Hamilton had to remortgage her house twice and went deeply into credit card debt. In 2006, when Hamilton exhausted her finances, she was hit by another false shortfall of £10,000. She called the post office for help. They sent round an auditing team who immediately shut down her post office counter and accused Hamilton of stealing £36,000. The post office then prosecuted Hamilton on charges of theft and false accounting. In 2008, Hamilton agreed to a plea deal where the theft charge would be dropped, but she would plead guilty to 14 charges of false accounting. Hamilton would not be sent to jail on condition of her repaying the £36,000 and her agreeing to not publicly disparage the Horizon accounting system. Hamilton sold her bakery and, in financial ruin, she found work as a cleaning lady. Meanwhile, it turned out that the auditing team had not found any direct evidence that Hamilton had stolen the money, and the post office had no right to prosecute Hamilton for theft in the first place. Thus, they had no grounds to force Hamilton to plead guilty to false accounting, but they went ahead and ruined her life anyway. Additionally, when Hamilton repaid the £36,000 that hadn't really gone missing in the first place, the post office reported the amount as part of their annual profits. In light of the post office's public pledge to be less of a financial black hole and become a profitable business, every little bit helped. The executive management of the post office had essentially stolen a woman's money to bolster their own public image and political position within the British government. And that's what they did with all the cash they extorted from sub-postmasters between 1999 and 2015. The bloated, overpaid bureaucracy at the top was ruining lives to cover up their mistakes and make themselves look good. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, both the post office and Fujitsu were well into damage control regarding their useless billion-pound accounting system. Fujitsu allegedly hired roughly 24 employees to sit in a computer room with remote access to the Horizons accounts of all the sub-postmasters in Britain who had adopted it. Their job was to allegedly spend day and night entering the accounts and scrambling to manually correct errors caused by the Horizon glitches. And this was despite the fact that the sub-postmasters had been told that there was no remote access to the accounting software in their shops. And therefore, it was the sub-postmasters who were ultimately responsible for any shortfalls. The Fujitsu employees would allegedly change the numbers in the sub-postmasters' accounts while they were serving customers or overnight while they slept. Frequently, the glitches were too numerous and severe for Fujitsu employees to undo the damage, so they would allegedly abandon their efforts and leave the sub-postmasters to bear the blame for the problems. And all this was apparently done to avoid admitting they had wasted £1 billion in taxpayer money. In 2003, Lee Castleton used his life savings to become postmaster in the town of Bridlington, Yorkshire. He moved his wife and 2 children into the flat above the post office, but things were ugly from the start. Castleton immediately noticed that the Horizon systems created discrepancies in the accounts. Castleton phoned the Horizon helpline a total of 91 times, but never managed to solve the problem. The shortfalls rapidly began to stack up within just a few months, and by March 2004, the post office accused Castleton of losing £26,000. Castleton's contract was terminated, his post office was closed, and in 2006, the post office sued him for the money. Castleton did not have any funds for a lawyer, so he represented himself in court. He countersued for £12,000, claiming that the post office had wrongfully terminated his contract. The judge found that the missing £26,000 was real and not just a concoction of the faulty Horizon system, that his postal branch had instead been mismanaged, and that Castleton was to blame. He was ordered to repay the £26,000 along with the post office's legal costs for the case, amounting to £321,000. Castleton declared bankruptcy, and his family were forced to live above the shuttered post office branch for years, because if they had sold the property, the money would be immediately claimed by the central company. Castleton was labelled a thief by the community, and his children were bullied in school because of it. Years later, it came out that the post office had sued Castleton, despite the fact they knew he would be unable to pay, in order to make an example of him and intimidate other sub-postmasters from disputing their shortfalls in court. In the town of Walsall, Staffordshire, Jess Cower, who ran the Lazy Hill post office, did not notice when a faulty Horizon pin pad started duplicating customers' transactions. Post office auditors arrived and accused Cower of stealing the duplicate money, amounting to £11,000. The police arrested Cower for theft. During interrogation, and without any legal representation present, postal investigators convinced Cower to plead guilty to the crime under the false promise that if she did, she could go back to work. Cower later changed her plea to innocent once she realised this was a lie, and when she found out the other sub-postmasters in Britain had experienced similar injustices. Seemingly, out of revenge, the post office increased the charges against Cower from 14 to 36 and doubled the amount of money they claimed she had stolen. The case dragged on for years, destroying Cower's mental health and causing her self-harm with a knife. She was committed for 6 months to a mental institution where she was depressed and semi-catatonic. When medication didn't work, Cower was subjected to 14 rounds of electroshock therapy. Ultimately, the case against Kaur was thrown out when it became clear the post office had no evidence that Kaur had actually stolen the money. The corruption of the post office continued to worsen, and on August 19, 2008, Michael Rudkin, union chairman of the negotiating committee of the National Federation of Subpostmasters, paid a visit to the UK headquarters of Fujitsu. Rudkin also had a post office of his own in Leicester. He had heard alarming reports from several union members of problems with the Horizon software. Rudkin was met by a Fujitsu employee and taken down to a room where a dozen technicians were allegedly logging into the private accounts of subpostmasters and manually changing the faulty calculations. Rudkin pointed out that the British subpostmasters had been assured that there was no remote access to their accounts. The Fujitsu employee must have realized that Rudkin had just seen something he wasn't supposed to, and Fujitsu later quote-unquote misplaced any record of Rudkin's visit. Within days, the post office accused Rudkin of losing £44,000 in shortfalls. But Michael Rudkin had been away on business on the dates the Post Office Limited provided for the shortfalls, and so Michael's wife Susan was accused of stealing the money while she covered for him at the post office. Susan Rudkin was prosecuted, convicted, and given a suspended prison sentence of 300 hours of community service. Meanwhile, Michael Rudkin's contract was terminated, he stood down from his union position, and he struggled to find other employment. There are serious allegations that the £44,000 Susan Rudkin was accused of stealing was not the result of a random glitch in the Horizon system. Rather, it's alleged that after Michael Rudkin's discovery that Fujitsu was tampering with the accounts of sub-postmasters, the post office and/or Fujitsu deliberately created a shortfall at Rudkin's post office in order to punish and discredit him, lest he go public with what he saw. It was a straight up frame job. Indeed, Michael and Susan Rudkin were labelled thieves within their community, and the union ultimately sided with the post office management. Fujitsu continued to claim that Rudkin had never visited their UK headquarters until years later. Rudkin dug out an email confirming the date of his appointment. Then Fujitsu changed their story, admitting that Rudkin had visited, but he was mistaken in his assertion that he had seen Fujitsu employees remotely accessing sub-postmasters accounts. We now know this was a lie. Such injustices continued to be perpetrated by Post Office Limited and Fujitsu. Between 1999 and 2015, over 900 people were prosecuted for theft, fraud, and false accounting. 236 of them did prison time. A further 3,500 people were coerced into paying Post Office Limited for the imaginary shortfalls created by the flawed Horizon software. The majority of the time, these shortfalls amounted to tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds, and yet almost all of them, at some point, were told that they were the only sub-postmaster in the UK who was having such problems with the accounting software. Meanwhile, 4 people committed suicide as a result of Post Office Limited ruining their lives. In 2008, British Member of Parliament James Arbuthnot was informed by one of his constituents that there was something wrong with Horizon and that sub-postmasters were being unjustly fined and persecuted for imaginary shortfalls. Arbuthnot investigated and eventually found 31 cases where this had happened. Arbuthnot began to raise awareness in Parliament about the issue, eventually forming a bipartisan group of MPs concerned about what was going on at the post office. In May 2009, Rebecca Thompson, a journalist for Computer Weekly, revived the story about Horizon from 5 years earlier, and the magazine published an expose of the faulty programming and the post office, telling the stories of 7 sub-postmasters. The post office management responded by saying that Horizon was quote-unquote robust and denied any problems with its programming. A few months later, in September 2009, a dozen of the affected sub-postmasters formed the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. Among their ranks were Alan Bates, the man of detail mentioned earlier, Jo Hamilton, the woman who was unjustly forced to plead guilty to false accounting, and Lee Castleton, the man who tried to fight the post office in court and was hit with a bill of over £340,000. Alan Bates quickly became the group's de facto leader, though he has always stressed that it was a group effort. The JFSA steadily grew in numbers, first a few dozen, then hitting approximately 150 members in 2015. But for perspective, there were approximately 11,500 sub-postmasters in the UK, so the group still represented a tiny fraction of the total. Many sub-postmasters hadn't been affected by the Horizon bugs, and those that were affected often were worried about retaliation from the post office if they joined. Nevertheless, the JFSA carried on, becoming increasingly vocal, with Alan Bates bringing aboard a forensic accountant who volunteered to work pro bono, and developing his contacts in government and the media. By 2012, the post office realised that public attention and the concern of MPs about the plight of sub-postmasters meant they at least had to be seen to be doing something. The thing about the post office is, for the bloated management at the top, it is a veritable gravy train. Despite running a company that rarely turns a profit, scores and scores of executives earn between £200,000 and £500,000 a year, plus the bonuses they can vote for themselves and the fringe benefits such as claiming tens of thousands in expenses that they ultimately hang around the necks of the taxpayer. When Horizon was introduced in 1999, the CEO of both Post Office Limited and Royal Mail was John Roberts. He had been in the job since 1995 but had to resign in disgrace in 2002 because the Postal Service was losing 1.5 million a day, compelling the closure of 3,000 sub-post offices and the firing of 30,000 employees. There are strong allegations, which appear to be supported by government documents, that John Roberts was fully aware that Horizon was a deeply flawed system. Roberts was succeeded by Adam Crozier, a man born with a silver spoon in his mouth with many upper-class connections who had previously somehow become CEO of the massive British advertising firm Saatchi & Saatchi at the tender age of just 31. With a similar miraculousness, Crozier next became CEO of the English Football Association at the age of 36, a highly coveted position managing the oldest and most prestigious football organisation in Europe, despite having zero experience in the business side of sport. When, in 2003, at the age of 39, Adam Crozier was made CEO of the UK Postal Services. His mandate was to make it profitable. Crozier accomplished this by sacking thousands of employees, closing even more post offices, busting up strikes, and making the postal service decidedly less punctual and efficient by cutting the daily number of deliveries in half. It was during Crozier's tenure that firing sub-postmasters for imaginary shortfalls and recording these extortions as profits went into overdrive. It was also under Crozier's tenure when some of the most disgraceful criminal prosecutions took place. As a result of all these tactics, the Postal Service indeed started raking in money. In 2005, it made a profit of about $2 million a day. However, it's easy to be a profitable business when the government gives you a virtual monopoly on delivery services nationwide. When that monopoly was broken in 2006 and private couriers were able to take up more space in the industry, the post office's revenue crashed. By 2007, the post office was losing £765,000 a day again. The post office would continue to stay in the red until Adam Crozier's departure in 2010. Crozier has continued to live a charmed life, becoming CEO of ITV, one of the UK's biggest television networks, until 2017, and then the chairman of Whitbread, a massive hotel and restaurant conglomerate, and chairman of British Telecom, another multi-billion-dollar company that suckles from the government tea and has an extremely checkered history from drone strikes to Chinese spies. As for Horizon, there are numerous allegations and some hard evidence that has not yet been tested in a court of law. That Crozier knew about the system's fatal flaws and that he was a key figure in the punitive actions taken against sub-postmasters. Despite that, Crozier has largely escaped widespread public criticism and any consequences since the scandal made the headlines. After Crozier's departure in 2010, the British government scrambled once more to make the postal service profitable. In 2011, they separated Post Office Limited from Royal Mail, and in 2012, they brought in Paula Venables as CEO of Post Office Limited. Since graduating university in 1981, Venables had worked as an executive in a variety of private corporations like Unilever, L'Oreal, and Whitbread, before winding up with a network director's position at the Post Office in 2007. Venables was also an ordained priest in the Church of England and cultivated a public image of being squeaky clean, bordering on holier than thou. Like Crozier before her, Venables' mandate was to make the Post Office profitable again. Venables eventually accomplished this, but was much less successful than her predecessor, recording profits of a piddling £90,000 per day at the height of her career. One of the things Paula Venables had to confront upon becoming CEO in 2012 was the growing demand for an investigation into the Horizon accounting system and the treatment of sub-postmasters. So she hired an independent firm of forensic accountants called Second Sight to investigate Horizon and the Post Office for any faults or wrongdoing. Second Sight agreed on the condition that the post office would not withhold documents and would join them in a quote, search for the truth. Instead, the post office did the exact opposite to avoid accountability. They redacted an excessive amount of the information they handed over to Second Sight, to the point that entire folders of hundreds of pages were mostly blackened out. There is also hard evidence that in 2013, Post Office Limited began shredding documents relating to bugs in the Horizon system. Meanwhile, Second Sight requested access to the files of the numerous prosecutions carried out by the Post Office, but 18 months went by and the Post Office never handed those files over. Second Sight suspected this was because the files proved that the Post Office had sought criminal charges against sub-postmasters without sufficient evidence. In July 2013, Second Sight issued an interim report that found Horizon had generated false shortfalls at 76 branches that they knew of. Privately, Second Sight's investigators suspected that the problems went much deeper, but they were constrained to what they could definitively prove with the limited documentation that the Post Office had supplied to them. Nevertheless, Second Sight's investigation continued. Meanwhile, in October 2013, Detica, a technology firm owned by BAE Systems, Britain's largest defence contractor, issued its own report saying that Horizon was, quote, not fit for purpose in a modern retail and financial environment. In response to these damning reports, in 2014, Post Office Limited established a mediation scheme where affected sub-postmasters could apply for compensation, but it soon became clear that the mediation scheme was a farce. Sub-postmasters were met with a wall of lawyers hired by the Post Office at great expense who fought tooth and nail against paying out any compensation or accepting any responsibility for serious wrongdoing. The Post Office rejected approximately 90% of all applications for compensation, and a year went by without a single case being paid out. Dozens of postmasters began walking out of application hearings. By December 2014, the bipartisan group of 114 MPs concerned with the Post Office scandal withdrew their support for the mediation scheme. Meanwhile, the Post Office had established a secret subcommittee called Project Sparrow, composed of CEO Paula Venables, in-house lawyer Chris Allyard, and a number of senior Post Office management staff. The purpose of Project Sparrow was to oversee all communications with Second Sight, the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, and government MPs. It has been alleged that Project Sparrow dealt primarily with information suppression and destruction of evidence, but these allegations have yet to be tested in a court of law. Two leaked transcripts from April 2014 revealed that the Post Office planned to fire Second Sight because they were not backing down in their requests for further documents and information. Meanwhile, a 2014 audit by the accounting firm Deloitte revealed that Fujitsu had remote access to sub-postmasters' Horizon accounts, in direct contradiction to what the sub-postmasters had been told. An email written by Paula Venables, later released to the public, reveals that she was also aware Fujitsu had remote access and she was seeking advice on if she could publicly deny it. Second Sight wrote another report in 2014 that was leaked to the public, where they found that sub-postmasters had not been properly trained to use the Horizon system, that the Horizon had many bugs, that numerous shortfalls had been wrongly attributed to postmasters, and that the hardware in post offices around the country was extremely outdated. The Post Office responded with a public statement renewing its denials that there was anything systematically wrong with the Horizon system. The near meaningless word robust was again thrown around with vigor. The Post Office added that Horizon was used by 11,500 sub-postmasters and a total of 78,000 postal workers in the UK, and that the roughly 150 aggrieved sub-postmasters represented only 0.19% of the entire workforce. It later turned out that the Post Office was lowballing the total number of sub-postmasters affected. In total, they had prosecuted 900 people and stolen money of approximately 3,500. On February 3rd, 2015, the Post Office was dragged in front of a parliamentary select committee to account for the findings of Second Sight and the allegations made by Justice for Postmasters Alliance. During questioning by MPs, the Post Office head of partnerships, Angela van der Bogard, claimed that they had turned over all documentation Second Sight had requested at the outset. The lead investigator for Second Sight, Ian Henderson, was sat right there and immediately refuted this claim. We know that Angela van den Bogard's statement was untrue. Then Post Office CEO Paula Venables said that they had uncovered no evidence of any miscarriages of justice with regard to the prosecution of sub-postmasters. There is documentary evidence that Venables was warned multiple times about the validity of numerous prosecutions for nearly 3 years prior to making this statement. Thus, Ian Henderson publicly called her statement a lie. Both statements made by the Post Office to the Select Committee constitute an act of misleading Parliament, which is a serious criminal offence. At the time of filming, neither executive has so far been prosecuted for this crime, nor any other crime. On March 10th, Post Office CEO Paula Venables prematurely terminated Second Sight's contract and halted all mediation with sub-postmasters. Nevertheless, Second Sight produced a second version of the report on April 10th, 2015 and released it to the public. They accused the Post Office of deliberately withholding information and shackling the investigation. They claimed that sub-postmasters were wrongly prosecuted in criminal court, that the Post Office appeared to be covering up the fact that Fujitsu had secret remote access to sub-postmasters' Horizon accounts, and that the Post Office likely had taken the money they extorted from sub-postmasters and listed it in their annual profits. The report also chided the Post Office for using the argument that 150 sub-postmasters represented only 0.90% of the total workforce, pointing out that total numbers didn't matter when Horizon and the Post Office had effectively ruined at least 150 lives. Again, we now know that the total number of people affected was much larger, including 4 suicides in 2015. Realizing that public scrutiny was growing too intense, Post Office Limited finally halted the prosecution of sub-postmasters for shortfalls. But not before hundreds of injustices had been added to the list. In 2010, West Byfleet sub-postmistress Seema Misra was accused of stealing £74,000 and thrown in jail for 15 months. Misra was pregnant at the time, and she later reported experiencing suicidal ideation. In that same year, Devon postmaster Peter Huxham pled guilty to fraud for a shortfall of £16,000 and was jailed for 9 months. Huxham thought his wife had stolen the money, his marriage fell apart, he fell into alcoholism, and he committed suicide in 2020 without following the inquiries and ever learning that Horizon was at fault. And of course, in 2013, Martin Griffiths, with whom we began this story, deliberately walked in front of an oncoming bus. The tragedies are too numerous to list, stretching into the hundreds, and several criminal and civil prosecutions were still ongoing when the Post Office halted them in 2015. But that, at any rate, was progress. After 16 years of atrocious corruption and human suffering, now that the Post Office had shut down Second Sight and any form of mediation, it was up to the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance to fight for redress and compensation. In 2016, Alan Bates was approached by Therium, a litigation fund where private investigators financially backed plaintiffs in civil suits in the hopes of getting a return on their investment should the plaintiffs win compensation. Therium wanted to back the sub-postmasters, and so Alan Bates gathered together 555 victims of the Post Office to launch a group action in civil court. On March 22nd, 2017, the case of Bates and others versus Post Office Limited was given the go-ahead. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Post Office lawyered up, spending $100 million that ultimately came at the taxpayers' expense, and tried every dirty trick in the book to derail the civil suit. The case was dragged out for 2 years, being divided up into a number of separate sub-trials. The judge, the Right Honourable Sir Peter Fraser, presided. Meanwhile, in 2017, Paula Venables, who was also a fairly junior Anglican priest in a tiny village in Bedfordshire, and ironically on the Church of England's Ethical Advisory Committee, was helped by her friends in high places to become one of the 3 finalists for the position of Bishop of London. She ultimately lost to another candidate, but it just goes to show how Venables continued to ride high on the gravy train, even at this late stage of the scandal. And she continued to preach morality from her pulpit in the village of Bromham throughout the trial. The High Court made several rulings on the sub-postmasters case. The first, in November 2017, was to stop Post Office management from dragging out the trial by claiming they had availability issues and scheduling conflicts until Therium and the sub-postmasters had run out of money. The second judgment, nearly a year later in October 2018, was to prevent the Post Office from striking down roughly 1/4 of the sub-postmasters' evidence, which might have crippled their case. The third judgment, handed down in March 2019, 2 years after the trial began, found that under the sub-postmasters' original contracts, Post Office Limited had no right to hold them accountable for massive shortfalls or to prosecute them in civil or criminal court. Post Office tried twice to appeal this verdict, but they were denied both times. Then, the post office demanded Judge Fraser be recused from the trial, claiming he was biased against them. In April 2019, the Court of Appeals led by Judge Coulson rejected this demand in a scathing 17-page judgment and accused the post office of trying to make the civil trial collapse. Coulson then ordered the post office to pay the legal costs of the sub-postmasters for the recusal application, essentially fining them £300,000 for wasting everyone's time. A fifth judgment was handed down in June 2019, stipulating that the post office had to make this payment now rather than wait until the end of litigation. Otherwise, Therium and the sub-postmasters ran the risk of running out of funds, which Judge Fraser speculated was probably the post office's intention. Finally, the sixth judgment, handed down in December 2019, found that Horizon was a deeply flawed system, that it was responsible for many of the shortfalls, and that, quote, its robustness was questionable and did not justify the confidence placed in it by the post office in terms of its accuracy. At this point, it was pretty clear to everyone that Post Office Limited was in trouble. The judge found that Horizon was at fault and that sub-postmasters had been prosecuted unjustly. And so the Post Office settled, offering to pay the plaintiffs £58 million in damages. Let that sink in. The Post Office spent over £100 million in legal fees to avoid paying 58. Meanwhile, Therium was nearly out of money and its investors were actually claiming back less money than they were originally due because over the past 2 years they had become emotionally invested in seeing the Post Office be brought to justice. And so the plaintiffs accepted the settlement of £58 million. Unfortunately, £47 million of it went to legal costs and to repay the investors, leaving 555 sub-postmasters to split the remaining £11 million. This worked out to be a measly £20,000 each. Most sub-postmasters had lost considerably more in repaying shortfalls and losing the life savings invested in their post office branches. And this speaks nothing of the unjust convictions and the psychological damage done to many of them. Meanwhile, back in April 2019, with the writing on the wall, Paula Venables stepped down from her £500,000 per year job as CEO of Post Office. But she had definitely feathered her nest before departing. Inexplicably, Venables was made a board member to the British Cabinet and became the paid chairwoman of the Imperial College Healthcare Trust. She also scored a spot on the boards of retail giants Dunelm and Morrisons, collecting an additional £140,000 per year. All told, during her time as CEO of the Post Office, Paula Venables squirreled away over £4.5 million in salary and £2.2 million in practically self-nominated bonuses. Such is life on the gravy train. And Venables still preached morality from her pulpit every Sunday and remained on the Church of England's Ethical Advisory Committee. To top it all off, Paula Venables was included on the 2019 New Year's Honours List and made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire for her services to the Post Office by Queen Elizabeth II, despite the fact that the 555 sub-postmasters had received very little compensation after a 2-year trial. The December 2019 verdict swung the doors wide open for further legal action. In March 2020, the Criminal Cases Review Commission began the process of quashing convictions. At the time of filming, 101 of the 236 criminal convictions of sub-postmasters have been overturned. Meanwhile, the British government announced they would hold a public inquiry into the scandal. On the question of compensating the victims of the scandal, the Post Office declared they did not have the resources to make adequate restitution and that the financial burden would have to fall on the British government. This essentially means that the burden falls on the British taxpayer. The government devised 3 compensation schemes. First, to more justly compensate the 555 sub-postmasters who had taken part in Bates and Others versus Post Office Limited. Second, to compensate a further 2,700 sub-postmasters who suffered financial losses from repaying shortfalls or were prosecuted in civil court. And third, to compensate those sub-postmasters who were wrongly convicted of crimes. After a few years of bartering, the British government declared that the 2,700 victims of extortion would be paid a minimum of £75,000 in compensation. Those victims who were wrongly convicted would get a minimum of £600,000. Evaluation of each case and negotiations over payments are ongoing. As for the original 555 sub-postmasters from Bates and Others versus Post Office Limited, the British government has dragged its feet on further compensating them beyond the £20,000 it already won. But again, negotiations are ongoing. When the government made a compensation offer to Alan Bates, he rejected it outright, saying it was 1/6 of of what he had asked for, and it was, quote, insulting and derisive. Bates also flatly rejected an offer of the Order of the British Empire in the New Year's Honours List, pointing out that Paula Venables was still a commander of the order. Speaking of Venables, in 2021, as public contempt of her grew, she resigned from the Cabinet, Imperial College, Dunelm, Morrison's, and the Church of England Ethical Advisory Group, but she remains an ordained priest and an extremely wealthy woman. Venables has issued several non-apologies over the years for what happened to the sub-postmasters and has repeatedly denied any criminal wrongdoing. But for the most part, she has simply fallen behind the words no comment. A television miniseries called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, dramatising the events of the scandal, was aired in early January 2024. For most people in the UK, this was the first time they had heard of the scandal. Public rage against Paula Venables reached fever pitch. On January 8th, an online petition demanding that Venables return her CBE to the King reached 1 million signatures. The following day, Venables released a public statement saying she would renounce the honour. On February 23rd, Charles III revoked Venables' CBE on the grounds of, quote, bringing the honours system into disrepute. In January 2024, the Metropolitan Police announced it was looking into the possibility of criminal charges against post office executives and Fujitsu employees for fraud, perjury, and perverting the course of justice. At time of filming, no arrests have been made. Meanwhile, Alan Bates and the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance have declared that if the police do not take action, they are looking into going after the perpetrators of the largest miscarriage of justice in British history in civil court. The fight isn't over yet, and it's very difficult to hold such powerful and well-connected people to account. It would be a mistake to say that the UK post office scandal was an isolated incident. The abuse of power by high-ranking executives in government departments, government-owned corporations, and even government-subsidised universities is surprisingly common. The management of these top-heavy organisations have, in several publicised cases, scapegoated low-level employees and prosecuted the average person to cover up for their own mistakes. They frequently withhold or destroy evidence. They misuse public funds to hire crack legal teams. They set up so-called independent inquiries that are in reality designed in-house to sweep all their misconduct and mispractice under the rug. All the while, they continue to pay themselves very handsomely and feather their nests for the next lucrative job should they have to resign. Very seldom do these people face any serious legal consequences for their wrongdoing. Maybe a bit of bad press, maybe a financial settlement, mostly borne by the taxpayer, but no jail time. They are the reason why the word bureaucracy was originally a play on words derived from aristocracy. They are an inconspicuous elite. The modern elite, the tin pot dictators who creep down the hallways of power and parasitically gorge themselves on the public purse. Furthermore, the UK post office scandal highlights a significant flaw in the British justice system and the judicial branches of the West in general. If the sub-postmasters, most of whom were financially ruined, had not received the assistance of private investors, they could never have afforded to take the post office to trial. And more often than not, such organisations just hire a crack legal team and outspend the plaintiffs until the case collapses. And in our case, the post office almost got away with it by straining Therium's resources to the breaking point. Justice is supposed to be blind. It's not supposed to discriminate by creed, class, or colour, and yet, frequently the justice system discriminates by the size of someone's coffers. The amount of money we have determins the quality of the representation we get. Far too often, we don't get the justice we deserve, we get the justice we can afford. Hopefully, the victory of the UK sub-postmasters, after decades of fighting, will prove a turning point in this sad state of affairs. But it's likely to be a long time before things begin to change.